The Browning X-Bolt comes from the factory, capable of great accuracy in my opinion. It's one of the few mass-produced rifles that are glass-bedded from the factory. It also has an adjustable trigger on it, and they come with this very high quality and very accurate Morocco barrels on them. Like or hate the X-Bolt, almost everyone concedes that they almost always shoot pretty damn good. If you watch the X-Bolt review video that I did over 3 years ago, you saw that I did some serious load development on the cheapest X-Bolt that they make, the X-Bolt Hunter, and shot easy and consistent sub-MOA groups with that gun. But people being people, I'm constantly bombarded by shooters who want to modify their X-Bolt rifles. Some people just hate that factory trigger. Some people want a different stock. And some people just want to properly pillar bed the factory stock that the gun came with. But there's almost no info out there on doing these things. In this video, I'll briefly cover the options for modifying and accurizing the Browning X-Bolt rifle. The factory trigger on the X-Bolt seems really hit or miss, and is possibly the only real issue that people usually have with the X-Bolt. The factory X-Bolt trigger is adjustable, but sometimes it's only adjustable down to about 4 pounds. In the last 5 years, I've seen X-Bolt triggers that you can easily adjust down to 3 pounds, and other rifles where you couldn't adjust that factory trigger down to anything under 4.5 pounds. And that's adjusted all the way out with the screw almost falling out. And to make matters worse, some rifles have really smooth, crisp triggers on them, and others are really gritty and rough for some reason. But for a rifle that's been sold for almost 15 years now and is extremely popular with hunters, aftermarket parts for the X-Bolt are surprisingly limited. You have 2 options to improve the trigger on an X-Bolt. You could buy a completely new Timney or Jard trigger, or you can install a lighter trigger spring from M-Carbo. Then you just remove this from your factory trigger and put the M-Carbo spring in. But each option has pros and cons to them. Aftermarket triggers, like this Timney trigger right here, will give you the best trigger you've probably ever used on a hunting rifle. It'll break very clean and consistently for you, and at whatever poundage that you set it at. You usually do have to do a little bit of inletting on the stock to fit these triggers, but you get the perfect trigger as a result of that limited amount of work you have to do to the stock. An aftermarket trigger might seem like the best $200 you've ever spent on your X-Bolt, but these things aren't as perfect as they seem. These aftermarket triggers eliminate your bolt lock feature on your X-Bolt. Basically, if you install an aftermarket trigger on your X-Bolt, this bolt lock button right here won't function, and you could basically lift the bolt handle up with the safety on. This is a deal breaker for a lot of hunters that stalk on foot with their rifles on a sling, because the bolt handle can now open while you carry it, which is why hunters love 3-position safeties, and why a lot of hunters bought the X-Bolt in the first place. So an aftermarket trigger for the X-Bolt is useless to many hunters because it disables the bolt lock feature. Your other option for an improved trigger on your X-Bolt, which is much cheaper and possibly a lot more practical, is to install an M-Carbo trigger spring on your trigger pack. This spring is actually very simple to install. You start by removing the factory trigger pack. Then remove the factory trigger spring through the hole. Then you install the M-Carbo spring through the bottom of the trigger pack, right through the hole. Then put some Loctite on the screw and adjust it to your liking. I set this trigger for a 2.5 pound trigger pull, which is where I like the triggers on my stocking rifles to be. Now you have a lighter trigger pull, you only spent $15, and you don't have to do any inletting on your stock. The M-Carbo spring sounds perfect, but not so fast. If your trigger was a little rough or gritty to begin with, this spring will not fix that. Your trigger pull, might be inconsistent because that heavy factory trigger spring was masking friction issues in the trigger pack itself. If this is the case with your gun, you'll likely have to pay a gunsmith to polish the sear on it, which will cost you probably the same amount as that Timney trigger would have cost you in the end. X-Bolt factory stocks vary from very high quality composite stocks to really cheap plastic flimsy stocks to decent walnut stocks. They're all bedded at the factory in Japan where they're made. I don't know if you can see the bedding right there. And the bedding is actually decent for a mass-produced product in my opinion. It's a much better bedding job using better bedding material than what Winchester does with the Model 70, which looks like it came out of a hot glue gun. So most hunters really won't have an issue with the bedding on the Browning X-Bolt, and it's looked at as a positive, not a negative. But sometimes people bought an X-Bolt with one of those cheap plastic flimsy crappy stocks and want to install a better stock, with less foreign flex on it. Also, some people, including myself, don't trust stocks without pillars in them for long-term use. Or maybe you just don't like the fit of the factory stock. So there's several legitimate reasons for rebedding a factory stock or buying a completely new aftermarket stock. Aftermarket stock options for the X-Bolt are extremely limited. Basically, your only options are, very expensive Macmillan or GRS stocks or a cheaper laminate Boyd stock, and that's basically it. The Macmillan and GRS stock options for the X-Bolt are really more tactically oriented in design, especially the GRS stocks. So they won't appeal to a lot of hunters. But the cheaper Boyd's laminate stock, which is a great durable stock, is very popular with hunters, but it adds a little bit more weight to the rifle. So let's see what this weighs compared to the factory walnut stock. Let's weigh some stocks for comparison. The factory X-Bolt stock that this rifle came with weighs 1 pound, 12.2 ounces. So 1 pound, 12 ounces. Pretty close to 2 pounds. And this aftermarket Boyd's Heritage laminate stock weighs in at 2 pounds, 6 ounces. 2 pounds, 6 ounces. So, you're looking at a difference of about 10 ounces. Another new development with these Boyd stocks is that Boyd's now lets you order stocks for the X-Bolt with pillars pre-installed in them, which makes things a lot easier. But no matter what aftermarket stock that you choose to buy, or whatever stock you plan on adding pillars to that's a factory stock, you're still going to need to bed the stock. Unfortunately, This is where things tend to get complicated with the X-bolt. Inside the stock of the X-bolt, you have this half-moon exposed cutout for the rear action screw to go through. And you have to add a pillar to this and bed it, which can be a real pain in the ass. Some other rifles have, something similar to this. And if you have experience with those, you can easily tackle this job. Before you do anything, you need to decide on a plan of attack. Just like with the factory stock, with the bedding in the factory stock, we're going to concentrate our bedding in the recoil lug area and the two flats where the action screws go through. The X-bolt has a tang-mounted safety that floats and really doesn't serve the purpose that a traditional tang does. Most gunsmiths don't bed the tang on X-bolts because it can cause torque stress in the action and cause function issues with the safety. So float the rear tang like you would in a Savage action. The biggest issue with these half-moon holes is that this area right here is very prone to cracking and breaking. You really want to avoid drilling or milling in this area as much as possible. For bolt holes like this, I use thinner steel pillars so I don't have to do any drilling on this. If you need to do any clearancing in this hole right here, I use a Dremel tool and go very, very slow. Your pillar for the rear action screw needs to have a notch cut in it for the magazine. See, it goes right in there. In my opinion, this is the biggest pain in the ass part of pillar bedding and X-bolt. You want to retain as much of this pillar as you can while creating a notch in it big enough to clear the magazine opening. Kind of a weird design, but yeah, you have to notch your rear pillar. And so you're not clearancing out a lot of material in there and risking chipping or cracking the stock. I use these, instead of those big fat aluminum pillars, I use these thinner steel pillars for that application in the rear. You can cut this notch on a bandsaw like I did, or it can be milled out, or you could put it in a vise, I guess, and use a cutoff wheel. Just don't clamp this thing too hard in a vise and distort the pillar. This rear pillar should be clearanced and fitted before you start the bedding job. You don't want to do this. You don't want to clearance this channel out after you bed this pillar. Once again, you'll risk chipping or cracking the stock if you do that. But the front action pillar and screw hole is just as easy as with any other rifle, and any commercial pillar can be used, or once again, you could make your own like I do. This Boyd stock was a very tight fit for this X-bolt barreled action, in my opinion. It was obviously milled so you can use this stock without bedding the rifle if you chose to. But even with this thin sporter barrel profile on here, I had to sand out a couple of hot spots in the barrel channel so this stock will free float. Because the stock was made as a direct fit, you'll definitely need to remove at least a 1/16 inch of material from the areas that you plan on bedding. Just make sure everything is roughed up and degreased really good, including the pillars, before you start the bedding process. This video is not an instructional video on how to bed a stock. I'm just going to give you pointers that relate directly to bedding an X-bolt. So I'll prep this whole thing, add release agent, and mix up some Marine Tex. When you're bedding a rifle, never clamp the rifle's action in a vise. If you clamp it in a vise, you're flexing the stock in slightly, and that will negate the perfect fit of the bedding around the action. I see a lot of people who should know better clamping rifle actions in a vise while they bed stocks, and that's just not right. I personally use this MTM cleaning station right here when I do my bedding jobs, and I find it works perfectly. Always, and I mean always, place screws in the action to guide the action into the stock when you're bedding it. Never add screws after you put the action in the stock to bed it. This will force bedding compound either up into your lug recesses, like it will, or maybe a Model 70, or on guns like this X-Bolt right here, it'll force the bedding compound up through the hole and into the barrel threads, and you'll never be able to change out your barrel again. Doing it this way is just so much easier and causes so fewer issues. You know, just make sure you do it like this. And you could buy these screws commercially, like these, or you can just make them yourself like I normally do. Also, on another point here, I believe these screws for the X-Bolt are actually metric M6 screws. They're not the typical quarter-inch screws like you see on a lot of American rifles. You need to make sure that the action screws remain centered in the pillars. And to do this, you need to put tape on the bolt shank so it fits snugly on the pillars and everything is centered. Like that, nice and snug right there. This is very important to both a stress-free installation and to keep the action centered in the stock. You know, there's nothing worse than having a bedding job to where you have to fish around with the screw inside the hole to get the threads to engage in the action. And that's a sure sign of a crappy bedding job. So always tape these up to snugly center the pillars inside of there. When I place the rifle into the bedding, I use the bottom of the breech compared to the edge of the stock as kind of a reference for leveling the action into the stock. I also install the bottom metal so I can be sure that the screws are centered in the holes right. And this ensures that the action isn't canted side to side and side of the stock. You know, I see so many bedding jobs where the action's off or it's not centered or it's canted in the stock, and that's not good. Also, I never screw the action down tight while the bedding is curing. You know, tightening the action screws will induce torque stress into the action. As you can see here, I use electrical tape to hold the action into the bedding, which results in a stress-free bedding job. If you've ever seen a rifle that shoots worse after bedding than it did before, it's because torque stress was induced sometime during the bedding process. Anyways, I clean up all the excess mud as much as I can, and I let it sit like this for 24 hours. So I'm going to show you one of the reasons why you don't bed the tang at all on a X-Bolt. And that's because the tang really isn't the tang. You can see under here, the huge hollow space under there. The trigger's like directly underneath this part of the tang. And the real tang is actually the trigger. See the safety mechanism right here? That goes in that recess right there. You can see you definitely don't want to put any bedding in any of that right there. So do not bed the tang on an X-Bolt. And you'll put a lot of torque stress on the action. And you might even screw up your safety or trigger function if you try to bed the tang on these things. After I remove the action from the bedding, I totally clean everything up, and I let the stock just sit like this for about 2 more days or more to let it fully cure with exposure to the outside air. And then after that, I'm going to seal up all the wooden surfaces with Renaissance wax. And as you can see, I bed about 3/4 of an inch to an inch in front of the recoil lug, all the way back to the second screw hole, and you can see that pillar in there. So, turned out pretty good, pretty satisfied. Three days after I started the bedding job, I slapped the action back in, torque it properly, and this rifle's ready to go to the range and shoot some groups. Browning says to torque both of the bottom screws down there to 35 inch-pounds, but McMillan says to torque their pillar-bedded stocks to 45 inch-pounds. So I'm splitting the difference here and torquing to 40 inch-pounds. Well, as you can see, the free-floating job turned out perfect. Absolutely. If you could see exactly how I like them. You can even see underneath right here. Perfect. You don't want too much of a gap with these for your free-floating job on your barrel because it just looks ridiculous. But you don't want to have your stock so close to touching the barrel, especially with a pencil barrel like this, to where when the barrel whips after a shot, it touches the material and throws off your point of aim, point of impact. So we don't want that, but this is about exactly what I want the barrel channel on a free float job for a hunting rifle to look like. So you can see I got 3 Benjis here, and take all 3 of these Benjis, and you can see that this baby is free floated all the way back to a 1/2 inch in front of the recoil lug, but nice and smooth, fully free floated. 3 Benjis, nice and smooth. So that's a really good clearancing job on the barrel. When this rifle was unaltered, I worked up a load of the 92 grain Hammer Hunter for this rifle, and those shot absolutely great in this gun. So I'm going to load up some of the exact same loads and see how they do now in this rifle with it bedded and with a lighter trigger installed in it. So let's set up the press and then head out to the range and see how it does. Another day at the range. All right, so went to the range today, shot a few groups, and took forever to do because of this pencil thin barrel. I wanted to cool down to almost a completely cold bore between each shot. I think I'm good there, but as far as shooting 5-shot groups, this was my best group of the day right here. And this is an improvement over what I got last time with the factory trigger and the factory stock with the factory Browning bedding in it. And I'll do a side-by-side right now so you can see what the differences were. So there you have it. in the 15-year history of the Browning X-Bolt, there's finally a video detailing how to accurize and modify one of them. I still find it hard to believe that there's just so little aftermarket support for such a popular rifle that's been around for so long. In reality, I think that the X-Bolt shoots so good from the factory that most people just leave them alone, and that's a good thing, for the exception of the trigger. A lot of people find that they do need trigger work. I have so many 25-06 rifles that I had planned on selling this rifle after I made this video, but in retrospect, you know, it has really kind of grown on me, and I just might keep it, at least for a little while, to hunt with. I might even add some checkering to this stock. But the tally rings and this Leupold VX6 scope with the Winplex reticle make this rifle really classy and functional. This coyote pattern laminate really matches, you know, a dry grassland or prairie environment. And I think this would make a really great pronghorn rifle, especially chambered in 25-06. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and as always, good hunting.